Welcome to Patty's Place, a place where we're going to talk about grief, dementia, and caregiving. I named this podcast Patty's Place in honor of my mom, Pat, who died from dementia about 2 years ago. I'm your host, Lisa. So hopefully grab your cup of coffee, your cup of tea, or if you're having a really bad day, a glass of wine, and let's get to chatting and know that you're not alone here in all of this. So today I'm very excited. Our guest is Ben Couch. He's the creator of Eastern Ergonomics, and a longtime healthcare educator. Ben has spent 40 years studying martial arts and over 20 years leading healthcare training at the national level. He's discovered that martial arts body mechanics can dramatically reduce caregiver injuries while improving care for people with dementia. Welcome, Ben. I'm very excited to talk to you today.
Thanks so much, Lisa. It's really great to be here.
Yeah, so you hold black belts in 8 styles of martial arts, including a 7th degree black belt in karate.
I do. It's been my lifelong obsession. I still have, in a lot of ways, no idea why that has spoken to me throughout my life so much. I really have always been a person who really values peace and communication and compassion. And to me, it's difficult to explain to people sometimes, but this is how I express it to the world, through my students, the people I give this knowledge to, and just having an area of passion and having something I love and being able to, for whatever reason, it happens to be martial arts, and being able to show that devotion and compassion and education to the world through that medium has just been a wonderful lifelong journey for me.
I don't think a lot of people realize that you do more than just quote unquote a workout in martial arts. They teach you so much more with the mind and feelings and everything. It encompasses so much more with it. I don't think a lot of people realize that.
Absolutely. It's at one of our core things that we evolved through is the conflict. When
Mm-hmm.
back before we kind of developed all these wonderful things out of our neocortex, and the things that we start to lose when dementia comes into the picture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we go back in time through kind of our evolution, and we see conflict has really informed our whole development as a species, and ultimately brought us to a place where we have reason and logic and rules and these very high functioning brain activities that allow us to now step away from conflict and have other ways of resolving things. So when I mean, it sounds like such a big picture when I talk about it like this, but when we really go back in time and look at what martial arts is looking at,
Mm-hmm.
in a way, it's really looking at the course of human evolution through, the brute violence of, the first caveman bashing the second caveman with a rock to get,
Mm-hmm.
the piece of meat, to, how do we negotiate without that now? How do we understand the root of that conflict without manifesting the violence of it? And it's a really fascinating thing to me about how do we live? How do we interact with other people and make the world better so that we don't need, if we understand conflict, then we don't need violence.
That's very true. I actually do. I have a black belt in Hapkido, and
Wonderful.
yes, and I know with Hapkido, a lot of it is the saying is "be the water, not the rock," and it really does
Hmm.
apply to dementia and caregiving because sometimes the my master and stuff would say you have to absorb your opponent's power sometimes in order to redirect
Hmm.
it with that. So it comes into play with dementia and caregiving because sometimes you do have to step out of your feelings and then think about the person who's ill and
Yes.
and put it onto them. So what was your aha moment when you realized martial arts body mechanics could solve a massive problem in healthcare?
So the first inkling I had of it was, as a lot of these things are, a total accident.
Mhm.
You couldn't plan for it, you couldn't predict it. I was sitting in IHOP, and I was actually with my instructor. I met my primary teacher, for the last, boy, since about 2009. He and I met at a mutual organization we were a part of, and I was so. I mean, I'd already been doing martial arts for 25 years at that point.
Mhm.
I met him because he was on my panel for my 5th degree black belt test in Taekwondo,
Okay.
and he was partnered with me. He was my demonstration partner, and I could just tell that he was, I thought I knew a lot at that point, as one does after 25 years. And I got in with him and realized this guy is so far above me. He's doing things I didn't know were possible. And so I went to him and said, look, I want to be your student. Now, this is in Texas. I live in Arizona.
Okay.
And he turned me down. And so there's a bunch of background for it. But ultimately, I said, I will fly out there every month, one weekend every month to work with you if you'll take me as a student. And under those circumstances, he agreed. He said, I won't do it if you're here once every 6 months. You just can't learn that way. So I made a radical commitment, kind of uprooted my life because this guy had answers I'd been searching for my whole life. So here we are getting ready to go for a full Saturday training. We went out to IHOP to get a big breakfast, and there's a gentleman standing next to me. We're waiting to be seated. I was seated. He was standing. And I saw his knee start to buckle as one of those things that just out of the corner of my eye, he was right next to me. And I just saw him start to go down. He was a senior, and I didn't think about it. I just stood up and, adjusted him.
Mm-hmm.
I've, basically took his humerus bone, which is a real key point in jujitsu because of how it ties into the rest of the chain down to the center of gravity. And I just bumped his humerus bone back into place, sat back down, and nothing, he just kind of looked at me funny. And in a heartbeat, without thinking about it, I used jujitsu to help somebody. And that triggered this thought. Up until then, like I said, I wasn't a violent person. It's not like I was looking at this because I was a bouncer in a bar or,
Right.
a police officer or, someone who deals with violence on a regular basis. I just enjoy the body work. I just love learning how the body functions like that. And, it clicked off to me that this doesn't necessarily have to be just about me. This doesn't have to be about my experience and my fun entirely. I love it, but what if, I'm not really out there using it to restrain people and all this stuff, and
Right.
I'm doing it for fun. What if I could actually, beyond teaching my students, put some good out into the world with it by looking at, like you said, I've had a national director role in the training space in senior living for over 20 years. Transfers are the number one injury. I mean, they devastate training budgets. Home and family caregivers even more so because they've got zero training. And there's a lot of these mechanics that just aren't out there. So I started taking those little chunks that made a big difference, those little tips that, you see someone who's, maybe smaller or maybe older, and they're just moving younger people around or heavier people very easily. And why aren't we using those mechanics for the things that are actually causing people injury in healthcare? So that's the long story of how I made this jump.
Well, no, it is very interesting because you're right. You don't caregivers don't think about how much it takes a toll on their body when they are taking care of their loved one. And if they're a caregiver in a senior facility, they're doing it for 8 hours a day. And if they don't
Yeah.
do it right, they're going to hurt themselves. With all the different black belts that you hold in the different martial arts discipline, is there a specific principle from those arts that kind of translate a little bit better directly to the safer patient transfers?
Several.
Okay.
So one of them, one of the, I'll go with some of the easy ones to explain online
Mhm.
because so many of them are tactile. You kind of
Yes.
have to feel it, but
Yes.
there's a few I think I can explain pretty easily online. So um, the first one is just a mental shift. So when we look at in any environment, whether it's in the home or whether it's in a healthcare environment, you look at the daily task list and it's overwhelming.
Yes.
For a home caregiver, geez, did we get the meds done? Do we have a doctor's appointment? What are we eating today? What kind of food might we be throwing at the wall today? Are we in a good mood? There's so much to think about in a
Mhm.
healthcare setting. I've got to get, I'm going to use some lousy healthcare lingo. I've got to get 5 people toileted and fed and all that, like very mechanical. How often do we go into a transfer or some really any kind of situation, and our head isn't even in there because in the situation, because we're already 5 rooms down the hall transferring you know the person before lunch, or we're balancing our checkbook trying to figure out how to get dad's doctor bill paid, or we're not present. So the first thing I do is I actually try to get people to be present and just say, okay, Just like, when we start class, when we start a martial arts class, at least a lot of the Eastern ones, you'll
Hmm.
just, you do your bow in.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
part of that is putting in your own head, I am here now and I am doing this. I have left balancing the checkbook, my coach yelling at my kids' soccer team, my dad yelling at me over medication. I'm leaving all that on the side and I'm just focusing here. So, one thing I tell people is the transfer doesn't start when you put your hands on the person. It starts as you're walking in the room. Think of like, I'm bowing into class. I'm, just
That's good.
personal. Yeah,
Yeah, good way
my
to think about
mind
it. Yeah.
is focused. And I'm sometimes I'll tell people, literally say to yourself, I'm about to do a transfer. I am transferring someone now, because if we allow our minds to go, then our body's not focused in the transfer either, and that's when mistakes start to happen. It's like they say, more car accidents happen closer to home. Why? Because we're on autopilot. We're not thinking about it.
Hmm.
I'm not thinking, okay, which turn do I have to take, and paying really close attention. I'm just letting, my autopilot run things. So when I'm doing, oh, I've got 17 transfers today. Well, number 3 may be the one I'm not paying attention to because I'm already working on number 10. And that's in my own head. And that's where injury happens. So mentally, I think there's a lot we can take from that. Physically, I like to look at things like balance points, posture. When I talk about posture and how that functions,
Hmm.
a lot of us now function like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, right?
Very true.
Because we have the cell phones, and we start life, kind of hunched over. We start our transfers hunched over,
Yeah.
and even just a small tilt of the chin, up or down, fundamentally breaks our connection with the ground. That perfect posture that routes force down, just like a skyscraper,
Hmm.
dropping all that force straight down into a stable base. If you think about a skyscraper, and on the top floor, you built like, another 500 feet off the edge just on the top floor. Well, that's going to create a real imbalance because it's not supported by the base. So our posture affects everything, our breathing affects everything, and the way we stand affects everything. So another one that I talk about a lot is what we call triangulation points in our balance. So when we stand, if you draw an equilateral triangle with our 2 feet as the base,
Hmm.
the third point in that triangle, both in front of us and behind us, is the weakest point of balance, like the third leg on a stool. So a lot of caregivers will square up with their feet squared. Well, that means our weakest point when I'm trying to bring someone up from standing
Hmm.
is the point where I'm trying to bring the person to. So I am pulling myself right over if I stand squared up with my feet.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
falling into them already.
Okay.
Or if they get going too fast, they come into me and I'm falling backwards and I have nothing to catch me behind. If I blade my stance and put one foot in front of each, in front of the other,
Hmm.
now I've rotated my triangulation point out to the side because my hips are off to the side. So it's not in front of me anymore. It's out of the equation. So that's little adjustments like that I see even the pros telling people to stand like that. Well, if we're really looking at how we move weight, that's that's in front of us, out in front of us. That's not a good way to do it. That's the way to do it if we're doing like a deadlift, if the weight is underneath us and we can rise straight up. But if we're pulling it in from out there somewhere, then having our feet squared, we start already being pulled over by the weight in front of us. Little adjustments like that. It takes a second to learn, but it makes a phenomenal difference in how stable we are as we're trying to do these transfers.
It makes a lot of sense. I didn't even think about all that because I would think the majority, and this is just based on when my mom ended up being, when she wasn't quote unquote mobile anymore, they were transferring her from, the hospital bed to the wheelchair, and the wheelchair to the power chair,
Yeah.
so those are like the majority of what you would transfer. Even at home, you would be
Yeah.
transferring with that. And yeah, when you're trying to grab them from the chair, you do have to stand them up for a second before you move them to the other place.
Mhm.
So what do you think that martial arts, also the mindset, also can help if you're dealing with a loved one or as a caregiver in a facility, if the patient is agitated?
Oh, absolutely. And this is where I think a lot of um, sort of modern understanding comes in a lot,
Hmm.
because when we talk, you know, essentially strictly martial culture and samurai and warrior and all that,
Hmm.
there's less emphasis on de-escalation and more emphasis on overwhelming, and sort of victory at all costs. Where in a lot of, again, we talk about how we've sort of evolved out of that mindset to where we're trying to de-escalate violence now.
Hmm.
So you look at really what a lot of has been created by, say, the legal system, or just growing in our understanding of human nature. We're now seeing a lot of professionals out there talking about how do we approach a violent, or even an agitated person, not necessarily even a violent person, but someone
Right.
who's really agitated. And so that's something I do with my students, because just from the standpoint of a martial arts teacher who is educating other people, you know if they go out and hurt somebody, even if it was justified, they're looking at lawsuits and
Hmm.
prosecutions and all. There's all these incentives to find other ways now that in the past were not so present. It was a little bit more, well, you got what you had coming. Now the legalization of things has really changed the landscape of how we think about violence. So we've got people like Rory Miller, he's a great author, talking about the use of force and how we can de-escalate and find ways around it. So he's an exceptional martial artist, and I've read everything of his I can get my hands on, because he was at a very high level response in prisons, and he had to deal with the worst of the worst, who would, like, they'd send him in when a high level prisoner would barricade themselves in their cell and they had to get him out. He dealt with real violence,
Hmm.
but he also has to deal with, as a martial artist, how do we translate that for people who aren't in that kind of situation? How do we de-escalate? So I like to take those principles and bring them back to, how do we just talk to people who are upset? Because
Right.
that's on the spectrum, right? It's being upset over my customer service is just a very low level. You're yelling at me about that. That's a very low level version of violence, because all those emotions that go into that eventually build up into a violent encounter. It's just we're dealing with it before. So how can we do things like actually just maybe the most powerful thing, shutting our mouths and listening,
Yeah.
letting people feel heard and validated. Oh, geez, I understand why you feel that way. Now that you explain it to me, man, I would feel that way too. Would you please tell me, what I can do to help this situation, as opposed to going into that defensive space?
Hmm.
How do we understand, when we understand what ramps us up in our own levels of violence or in our own levels of agitation, how do we calm that? And a lot of times it's just having the confidence and the experience to model being calm, so that the other person can realize that you're not engaging in that agitation, but you're there to help them out of it. So I think martial arts is very important in that, especially if we're embodying that highest level of it, in my mind, which is eliminating the need for violence. How do we make sure that it's Sayonouji, the concept of, in Japanese sword, victory while you're still in the sheath. I achieved victory without ever unsheathing my sword. And how do we take that sort of highest level of martial arts intelligence and mastery and translate it into no violence at all?
Well, right, and I think, like you said, to think about going into the room being calm, like you were entering, one a class or that, and to try to put yourself into your loved one, or if you're a caregiver in a facility, thinking about the patient there, because maybe they're scared, maybe they don't understand what's
Yeah.
going on, like they don't know why you're touching them.
Hmm.
They're not trying to attack you. They just don't
Right.
understand, or
Right.
and it's hard to give up that independence too. That it's hard to admit that you need that help, with it, to try to understand that instead of get angry at the person, uh, with that as
And,
well.
and, I, and I think that's what a lot of violence stems from, is we don't understand each other. We have
Yeah.
needs, and we view them as competing when most of the time they're not.
Right.
But we don't know how to talk about them. And when dementia enters the mix
Mhm.
and communication breaks down and someone maybe doesn't have the word for bathroom
Right.
anymore. You get dropped. I kind of do a thought experiment with people and I say, okay, imagine you get dropped all alone in a country where you don't speak the language and you don't know how to ask for help and you don't know anyone and you have to go to the bathroom right now. Are
Mhm.
you going to be agitated? How are you going to express that need? And it's worth thinking about because so much of the dementia miscommunication, I think, is attributing behaviors to their being difficult.
Mhm.
Well, I'm difficult when I don't have a bathroom nearby and I really need to go. I'm,
Right.
I'm difficult. My wife carries around, a little power bar in her purse because she knows I get hangry when I don't eat because,
Exactly. Yeah.
she just knows but, if people don't know that about me, and I don't communicate it, it's going to go badly. So that communication of needs and especially communicating with folks and understanding at a deep level when people don't necessarily have the words anymore. How do we interpret that foreign language that they're speaking into something that can meet the needs of all parties?
What would you say if you could get every healthcare administrator to understand one thing about caregiver injuries, what would it be?
First off, is that they're not an inevitable part of doing business,
Okay.
um, and that's a lot of. I, I like to I like to look at unrealized assumptions. That's something that I'm always asking myself, like, what don't I know that I don't know? What am I missing? That there's always a perspective I'm missing. There's always a piece of information that could help me with something. And what am I assuming that I don't realize I'm assuming? So I started in healthcare in 2001, and over the course of that time, working as a national training director for a group of we had between 60 and 80 retirement communities, at any given moment. Um, One of the things I heard from risk managers all the time was, these transfer injuries are killing us. We're
Mhm.
spending so much time, we're spending so much, you know, time with the state, time with workers' comp, money on all of these things. And then I looked at, what are we doing about it? And the answer was basically nothing. We have an injury and then we go do the same training that created that injury in the first place. We
Mhm.
haven't updated, we've added things like, like you were mentioning, and they're great, Hoyer lifts and,
Mhm.
transport devices and all of these devices. But at the end of the day, we're hoping those save us from training that doesn't work because the assumption I'm reading into this a little bit just based on my experience, but it seems like the assumption is that this is inevitable. We're just going to have these things. We have brought training to its ultimate place and we're stuck with what we've got left. And I think that's an assumption we don't realize that we've made. There are better ways to train on this. And it strikes me as crazy that I'm looking around the field at like, who are my competitors? And I'm not really finding anyone else who's looking at this differently, which just blows my mind. If it's the number one cause of injury in one of the most dangerous professions in the United States,
Mhm.
more so than coal mining, steel mills, prison guarding, prison
Yeah.
guards are safer than caregivers. Why
Yeah.
are we not reconsidering this? So that's what I really challenge healthcare administrators with. What we're doing isn't working. So wouldn't you like to shelve the complaints and just find a better way?
And I know just from the personal experience witnessing the caregivers that took care of my mom, I it is such a hard job, and they don't get paid very much for what they
Yeah,
have to take care of, and that yeah, it would be nice for the administrators to look at that, give them more training, even give them more training with dementia, because even on the memory care
yes,
floor, not a lot of the caregivers really understood, and no fault of them, they weren't given that training, to understand that an agitated person with dementia, you have to
yeah,
handle them a little bit better, you know. And the number one thing with dementia too is that they do not like showers. I don't know. I'm not really
Yeah.
sure why that is. I don't know if it's because of the way the water hits their skin or something, but that is always a
Mhm.
fight uh,
Yeah.
with that.
And
So I want to make sure we talk about, as you said, you do this training. You have two different websites. Is that correct?
so my company website is illumined.com,
Okay.
elumned.com.
Okay.
The program that I offer is called Eastern Ergonomics.
Okay.
That's one of my programs. That's the one that deals with the ergonomics and the transfers and lifting. So that one is all one word, easternergonomics.com.
Okay. And so I
And
know you're based in Arizona, but can other
mhm.
facilities in different states, are you able to work with them, or how could they get in touch with you? Just go to that website, or
Yep, absolutely. That site has all my contact information on it, and I'm happy to work with people, anywhere. I do work in person, so at least
okay.
for initially. So that's one of my requirements to work with me is you've got to feel what I'm doing, and I've got to feel what you're doing because some of the changes are so subtle that unless I'm in the room with you, it's hard for me to coach
Oh,
or
right.
even necessarily feel because some movements you're just using different muscles. It looks the same, so I do like to be in person with people. There's some things I can do online, some basics, but for real healthcare stuff, as long as you're willing to have me in person, I'm really glad to go work with anyone anywhere.
And then you were just mentioning too before we started this, you have a new it's an online class for the home caregiver. Can we talk about that for a few minutes?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's something that I'm offering. I've got a separate registration page for that. It's called unbreakyourback.com. It's all
Okay.
one word. Um, and it is going to be an online course. This is my first launch of it. I'm experimenting with it. It's going to be on April 25th and it's going to be a 2-hour class, from 10 to noon, Pacific time.
Okay.
Uh, and it's kind of covering a lot of the information that we talked about earlier, but in a lot more depth. So how do
Mhm.
we hold our breathing? How do we hold our posture? How do we think about our balance points and some basics of body movement that I can convey online without the touch?
Mhm.
But there's still really powerful ways to help home and family caregivers just get a little bit of an edge because you look at even the pros who have had, the what I kind of consider to be substandard training. At least it's some kind of training, and they have people around to reinforce and who are aware of that. They're kind of looking, like, oh, there's $100,000 injury. Hey, let's stop that before it happens. Home and family caregivers don't have that, so
Right.
they're doing their best. They're doing what worked yesterday, even if it almost made them fall or even if it almost took their back out. So there's a lot we can do for people who haven't had any training in a real short time, that will give them some information that even the pros don't have unless they've worked with me, and it'll really help them out. And a lot of that comes from just my work with my own mom,
Okay.
because my mom has Alzheimer's disease. I've been her caregiver, and I've now it's different when you watch caregivers transfer someone who's your mom and you're
Mhm.
watching with the son's eyes.
Yes.
You can watch folks transfer other people all day long, but
Right.
suddenly it's my mom and you better do it right. So I'm
Well,
looking real careful and I'm seeing, like, oh, there's these problems and how can we fix those for, in a different kind of setting.
my mom was she did not like being in the wheelchair. She actually would shuffle her feet with it. And when they
Yeah.
would go to transfer her from the wheelchair to her power recliner, I think she just was so nervous. She would grab
Hmm.
onto the TV, and the poor caregivers, there was always two of them, and they would
Yeah.
have to be like, "No, no, no, Pat," and they would have to grab that plus try to transfer her over because
Uh-huh.
she was not having that. She was like,
Yeah. And now we're back to conflict, right?
right.
How do we get on the same page, in a situation like that? It was really interesting because my mom was hospitalized after a fall,
Mhm.
earlier this year, and so she was, you know very confused. She was kind of agitated and confused, and very tired, sleeping a lot. and she just hated. She was immediately going to, as soon as she would wake up, pull out the IVs and get out of the hospital bed
Mhm.
after a fall.
Right.
And it was interesting because it was in a hospital. You've got all these medical professionals around, and they really didn't know how to work with someone who had dementia,
No, they really don't.
which it's a very specialized thing. And I knew I shouldn't be surprised, but that like son in
Mhm.
me was still like, what are you people doing? Don't you know how to do? So
Yeah.
immediately, the person who was sitting with her, because she had to have someone sitting the full time, to make sure she didn't do those things, would say, she'd start to sit up and get out of bed. And the person would say, no, no, Beth, you have to sit down. You have to lie back down. You can't get out of bed. And how do you think that went?
Right.
And so I'd go over and she'd start sitting up to get out of bed. And I'd say, oh, Mom, thank you. Thank you for the hug. You wanted to give me a hug. Thank you so much. That was so nice. Would you like to lie back down now? Oh, yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah.
And, so how do we reroute those conversations to where it, you know, again, I say the transfer has to start before we put hands on the person. What you just described,
Mhm.
they're they're not setting up the transfer necessarily. I'm not trying to pick on
No,
anybody.
no.
We
No, I
all,
understand. Yeah.
I've just, as a broad example,
Right.
have we kind of taken those sources of agitation out of the way beforehand? Have we dealt with them? Have we figured out how do we get on this person's side so that we both have the same goal, as opposed to I want you to move over there and you want to stay here and I've got to figure out how to trick you, or
Yeah.
how do I get you to want to do that too? How do I talk to you so that we have the same goal in mind?
Yeah.
And again, that goes back to, when you look at jujitsu or aikido, or hapkido, I tell my students, the person who's being thrown tells you what kind of throw they want to be tossed with. It depends on what, if they push you, they want to go a certain way. If they pull, they want to go a different way. They're telling you what to do. You don't try to tell them what to do. They'll tell you how they want to be thrown.
Mhm.
The person who is being transferred is going to tell us what they need. Are we listening? Are we listening to what they are telling us about how they want to be transferred? Do they want to sit by the television a little longer? Are they bored with the television?
Right.
Have we removed the sources of agitation before we try to do? So I think it's a really holistic problem. Kind of like I think martial arts is a really holistic solution. It's a model that we can use that gives us insight into the conflict that's happening, or just how to ease transitions like that.
This has been very, very interesting, and
Oh, good.
it's very enlightening too because it is in some ways it's so simple, but yet it's so important. Again, it goes back to like you said, trying to get into that person's space, try to eliminate the conflict with it, and also to take care of the caregiver too when you're
Mhm.
doing these types of things.
Yeah.
So we will definitely put all of your websites on here so people can check it out and hopefully get in contact with you. Sign up for if you're a home caregiver, sign up for that because you don't want to break your back. Because if you're hurt, you can't take care of your loved one
Yeah.
for that. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. It's a real pleasure. Thank you,
Thank you.
Lisa.
So I hope everybody has enjoyed your cup of coffee, your cup of tea, your glass of wine. And just remember, please leave us a review, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and hopefully you'll just know you are not alone. And join us for another edition of Patty's Place.